The night of January 30th, 1945. A flat, open field in central Luzon in the Japanese-occupied Philippines. 120 American Rangers are crawling on their bellies across the last open ground in full view of a Japanese guard tower toward a prison camp. Leading them is Lieutenant Colonel Henry Mucci, a wiry West Point officer with a pipe clenched in his teeth. Behind the wire ahead of him are more than 500 American prisoners, the dying survivors of the Bataan Death March. Mucci has brought his men 30 miles behind enemy lines to get them out. If anything goes wrong, everyone dies. Henry Andrew Mucci was a 33-year-old West Point graduate from Bridgeport, Connecticut, the son of Italian immigrants, known for his pipe, his physical toughness, and a flair for the dramatic that earned him the nickname Little MacArthur. He commanded the 6th Ranger Battalion, an elite unit trained for exactly this kind of mission, fast, deep, and behind enemy lines. When the American returned to the Philippines, the Pacific raised the terrifying possibilities, 8, that the Japanese would murder their prisoners before they could be freed. The job of saving the men at the Cabanatuan camp came to Mucci. He told his men it was strictly volunteer. Every one of them went. But to understand why this rescue had to happen at all, and why it had to happen now, in a desperate hurry, we have to go back to what the Japanese had just done a few hundred miles away. In December 1944, on the island of Palawan, Japanese guards had herded around 150 American prisoners into air raid trenches, poured gasoline over them, and burned them alive, shooting the few who tried to escape. The message reached American command clearly. As the Japanese retreated, they were killing their prisoners. The men at Cabanatuan, survivors of Bataan who had already endured 3 years of hell, were next on that list. The prisoners in the Cabanatuan camp were the living remnant of the worst American military disaster of the war. They had surrendered at Bataan and Corregidor in 1942. They had survived the Bataan Death March, where thousands died of beating, starvation, and execution. They had survived 3 years of captivity, disease, and slow starvation. By January 1945, the strong had been shipped to Japan as slave labor, and what remained at Cabanatuan were the sick, the weak, and the dying, more than 500 men too broken to be of use, waiting to see whether liberation or a massacre would reach them first. Mucci's plan depended on more than his Rangers. It depended on the Filipinos. Local guerrilla forces under a brilliant commander named Captain Juan Pajota knew the ground, the enemy, and the people. Filipino civilians would hide the Rangers' approach, quiet their dogs, and provide carts to carry out prisoners too weak to walk. Pajota's guerrillas would block the roads against Japanese reinforcements. American Alamo Scouts went ahead to study the camp. The plan was for the Rangers to cross the last open field after dark, hit the camp in a sudden assault, kill the garrison, and get 500 broken men out before the Japanese army could react. Getting to the camp meant crossing 30 miles of enemy-held country and then a final stretch of flat, open ground with no cover at all, overlooked by Japanese guards. The Rangers crawled across it on their stomachs, inch by inch, freezing in place whenever a sentry looked their way. To pull the guards' attention to the sky, an American P-61 Black Widow night fighter flew low over the camp. Engines roaring, pretending to be a crippled aircraft, a deliberate distraction while 120 men crept across open ground a few hundred yards away. It worked. The Rangers reached their jump-off positions undetected. At 7:45 in the evening on January 30th, the Rangers opened fire. The assault was sudden and overwhelming. In the first minutes, they cut down the guard towers, blew open the gates, and poured into the compound, killing the Japanese garrison in a furious close-range fight. Captain Robert Prince, who had planned the assault, fired the signal flare. The Rangers moved through the camp, shouting for the prisoners to head for the gate. But the prisoners, starved, sick and stunned, at first did not understand. Some hid, thinking the Japanese had come to kill them. Some wept. Some had to be carried bodily out of the only place they had known for 3 years. What made the rescue possible was happening a mile away, and almost no one remembers it. If this is the kind of history you want more of, subscribe. We are just getting to it. While the Rangers cleared the camp, Captain Juan Pajota and his Filipino guerrillas held the Cabu River bridge against a Japanese force of hundreds rushing to reinforce the camp. Pajota's men, with a single bazooka and pure ferocity, stopped the counterattack cold and held long enough for the Rangers and 500 freed prisoners to get clear. Without the Filipinos, every American in that camp would have died. The greatest rescue in American history was, in large part, a Filipino victory. Now came the hardest part, moving more than 500 men, most unable to walk, across 30 miles of enemy country before dawn. The Filipino villages had prepared for this. Dozens of carabao carts, the slow wooden ox carts of the Filipino countryside, appeared along the route, and the freed prisoners were loaded aboard. Whole villages turned out in the dark to feed the men, carry them, and guide the column. The Rangers and their guides walked the broken prisoners and rolled the carts through the night. A long, fragile line of the rescued and the rescuers, moving toward the American lines, praying the Japanese would not catch them in the open. They made it. By the morning of January 31st, 1945, the column reached American lines. More than 500 prisoners had been freed from Cabanatuan, and the cost to the rescuers had been astonishingly small. Only 2 Rangers were killed. One of them was the battalion surgeon, Captain James Fisher, mortally wounded during the action, who had gone on the raid to care for the very prisoners he would die trying to save. A few of the freed prisoners died on the way out, too far gone to save. But 500 and more men who had been left for dead were carried back into the free world. It was the most successful rescue in American military history. The freed prisoners were skeletons. Many weighed under 100 pounds. They had not seen a friendly uniform in 3 years when they realized they were truly free, that the men who had stormed the camp were Americans, that the nightmare was over. Grown men wept and clung to their rescuers. The story of the Cabanatuan raid flashed around the world. In the dark winter of the Pacific War, here was an unambiguous triumph. 500 living skeletons snatched from under the enemy's guns. Henry Mucci and his Rangers became overnight heroes, their faces in every newspaper in America. Mucci was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, the nation's second highest award for valor. His Rangers and the Alamo Scouts were decorated. The raid was held up as a model of daring and planning, studied in war colleges and later made into films. For a brief time, Henry Mucci was one of the most famous soldiers in America, the dashing, pipe-smoking Ranger who had gone 30 miles behind enemy lines and brought 500 men home. He was sent on tours to promote the war effort. He was, in 1945, exactly the kind of hero a tired country wanted. And then the war ended and the country moved on. When the war was over, Henry Mucci left the army and came home to Connecticut a celebrated man. He tried to turn that fame into a public life. In 1946, and again afterward, he ran for the United States Congress from Connecticut. He lost. The hero of Cabanatuan, who could lead 100 men through 30 miles of enemy country, could not win an election at home. The spotlight that had found him in 1945 moved on to other men and other stories. Mucci, still in the prime of his life, had to find something else to do with it. So Henry Mucci left the country he had become famous in. He went into the petroleum business and spent years working abroad, in India and across the Far East, a long way from Connecticut and a long way from the headlines. He raised a family. He lived a full, private life. But the man who had led the greatest rescue in American military history spent his later decades almost entirely unknown to the public that had once cheered him. The raid was remembered. The men were remembered. The leader slowly was forgotten. Henry Mucci died on April 20th, 1997 in Florida. He was 88, and if Mucci faded, the men who made his raid possible faded even further. Captain Juan Pajota and his Filipino guerrillas, who had held the bridge and saved the entire operation, were for decades barely mentioned in the American telling of the story. The villagers who hid the Rangers quieted their dogs, fed the prisoners, and gave their ox carts to carry the dying. They were almost entirely written out. Pajota received meaningful American recognition only late in his life. The Cabanatuan raid is remembered as an American triumph. It was also, and just as much, a Filipino one, a debt the American story took half a century to begin to acknowledge. There is a question in the Cabanatuan story that goes beyond any one man. Why is it that the deed is remembered but the doers are not? Almost every American knows nothing of Henry Mucci, less of Robert Prince, who planned the assault, and nothing at all of Juan Pajota, who held the bridge. The raid appears in films and textbooks. The men who carried it out died, most of them, in obscurity. Mucci himself never seemed bitter about it. He had done the thing. 500 men had lived because of it. Perhaps, for a soldier, that was supposed to be enough. Though it is fair to ask whether a country owes its rescuers more than a forgotten name. So who should we remember when we remember Cabanatuan? The dashing colonel who led it and then lost 2 elections and vanished into the oil business abroad. The quiet captain who planned the assault, the Filipino guerrilla commander, without whom every prisoner would have died, and whom the American story ignored for 50 years. Or the 500 broken men who walked out of that camp and got to grow old. Henry Mucci would probably have said the last group, and only the last group, but the men who saved them deserve their names spoken too. History remembered the rescue. It nearly forgot the rescuers. Lieutenant Colonel Henry Andrew Mucci died on April 20th, 1997, at the age of 88. He led what is still considered the most successful prisoner rescue in American military history. 120 Rangers, a band of Filipino guerrillas, and more than 500 lives carried out of the enemy's hands. The West Point officer with the pipe and the nickname Little MacArthur. The hero a tired country cheered in 1945 and then forgot. The man who could lead 100 soldiers 30 miles through the enemy but could not win an election at home. And never once said it was unfair. If your father, your grandfather, your uncle, anyone in your family served in the 6th Ranger Battalion, the Alamo Scouts, the Filipino guerrilla forces, or survived Bataan, Corregidor, and the prison camps of the Philippines, leave their name and what they did in the comments below. Don't just leave the name. Tell us one thing about them. One thing they did, one thing they said, one thing you remember. The men who were there deserve more than a name in a database. They deserve to be remembered as people. Subscribe. You want the next story. There are more of them.